Hello, everyone, and welcome to our midweek Bible study. In this study, we're going to be looking at Judges chapters 15 and 16. This will wrap up our study of the book of Judges as we study Samson. This is part 2 in our study of Samson. As we noticed last week when we began studying Samson, we saw that Samson had a lot of opportunities. God gave him 20 years to overcome the enemy, and he was primarily tasked, really exclusively tasked with fighting against and defeating the Philistines. But as we're going to see tonight, in the end, and many people are familiar with the study of Samson, so this is probably no surprise to you. In the end, it was Samson who ultimately was overcome. And his story is a very sad story in the Bible. He is complimented in a list of judges. He's complimented for his faith in Hebrews chapter 11. But that's really one of the only positive things that's mentioned about Samson in Scripture. He had a lot of physical strength, had enormous physical strength. But in conquering others with that physical strength, he did not have inner strength to be able to conquer himself, to be able to conquer his own will. And so we're going to kind of see the outcome of the story tonight. One of the scriptures to keep in mind as we study Samson is what Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 12. Therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. And that certainly is something that that thought is something that Samson should have learned. Well, as we look at chapters 15 and 16 tonight, first of all, in chapter 15, we're going to examine this under the heading of Samson disregarded the warning signs. Samson disregarded the warning signs. Now, in chapter 14, and we didn't talk about this really in detail the last time in our last study, but Samson married a woman, a foreign woman, against his parents' wishes, and at the wedding feast, they wanted Samson to give them a riddle, or Samson rather posed to them a riddle, and said, if you can answer it, this is verse 12, Samson said to them, let me pose a riddle to you. If you can correctly solve and explain it to me within 7 days of the feast, then I'll give you 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothing. But if you cannot explain it to me, then you shall give me 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothing. And they said to him, pose your riddle that we may hear it. Now, this kind of goes back to what we studied last week about Samson when he killed the lion, and then later he saw that some honeybees had made a hive in the lion's carcass, and he took some honey out of the carcass of the lion from the honeybee hive. And so with this in his mind, then he says, well, I'm going to make a riddle out of that. And the riddle is in verse 14, out of the eater came something to eat. Now the lion is the eater, but out of the lion came something to eat. That would have been the honey. And out of the strong came something sweet. So the lion was the strong, the honey was the sweet. So he thought, well, this is an easy way for me to get a new wardrobe, 30 changes of garments. And they can't figure it out, so they go to Samson's new wife and they say, you better tell us or we're going to kill you and your father and burn your house down. And so she just aggravated him persistently until he told her the answer to the riddle. Verse 16, then Samson's wife wept on him and said, you only hate me, you do not love me. You've posed a riddle to the sons of my people, but you have not explained it to me. And he said to her, look, I've not explained it to my father or my mother. Now, I'll tell you why he hadn't explained it. Because as we talked about last week, it was sinful what he did, because he was a Nazirite. The dead carcass was unclean, and he just went ahead and did it anyway. And then, unbeknownst to his parents, they became ceremonially unclean. So what he says here, I haven't explained to my mother or my father, well, that doesn't mean anything. The reason he did that is so he wouldn't expose himself as in the sin that he had committed. Well, verse 17, he eventually tells her, because she just pressed upon him so much, and so she then tells the guests, the Philistines, and they go and tell Samson the answer to the riddle. Verse 18, what is sweeter than honey, and what is stronger than a lion? Well, he knows how they have figured this out, and he says, if you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have solved my riddle. Now, this explains a lot why Samson has a problem with women. He calls his wife a heifer. And, of course, certainly no one would do that today. And I'm inclined to think that it was an insult even back then. And I know women were not treated well at all in those cultures, in those times. But certainly this was as much of an insult then as it is today. And so it's no wonder that his wife isn't all that pleased with him. Well, verse 19 says, Spirit of the Lord came upon him mightily, and went down to Ascalon, and he killed 30 of their men, took their apparel, and gave changes of clothing to those who explained the riddle. So his anger was aroused, and he went back up to his father's house. So he killed 30 men to get the 30 changes of clothing. Now, he does it in anger. He does it in spite. Now, these are the enemies of God's people. And it's not righteous indignation. He's not going and slaying them because he's righteously indignant because they are the enemies of Israel, because they've enslaved the people of Israel. He's just mad because they found out his riddle. And so he says, well, I'll show them. I'll take the 30 changes of clothing from their own people. And so he kind of gets pouty. If you want, and this is my opinion, okay, this isn't you're not going to find this in the Bible. This is in 1 Paul 1:1 when it comes to studying Samson. But if you want my explanation of what kind of man Samson is, he's a spoiled brat. Now that's exactly the way he's acting. He gets mad and he says, well, I'm going to go home. So he goes home, and his father takes his wife and says, well, if he doesn't want you, I'll give you to another man. That's exactly what he did. So when we come to chapter 15 then, it's in this context of he's left. He went away in a huff, but now he wants to come back. He wants to come back to his wife. Chapter 15, verse 1 opens up with, after a while, at time of the wheat harvest, it happened Samson visited his wife with a young goat. And so he wanted to go back, and, that really helps to make things up when you take a young goat back. So his father says, well, no, I've already given her to another man. And so this angers Samson, and he goes out and he sets their fields on fire, their fields of wheat. Beginning in verse 2 here, chapter 15. Her father said, I really thought that you thoroughly hated her, therefore I gave her to your companion. Is not her younger sister better than she? Please take her instead. And Samson said to them, this time I shall be blameless regarding the Philistines if I harm them. Now, he says, this time I shall be blameless concerning the Philistines if I harm them. What does this mean? I think what it means is that Samson knew the last time when he killed those 30 men to take their garments, that his motives were not pure, and that he bore some blame for that. So he went, verse 4, he went and caught 300 foxes. He took torches and turned the foxes tail to tail, and put a torch between each pair of tails. Well, this is something I'd sure like to see. I mean, number one, just catching 300 foxes is one thing, but then to keep them all in one place and take them, put them tail to tail and tie a torch in between them and light the torch on fire, I have to wonder how long that took. But anyway, he sets them loose into their wheat fields, and of course that burns up their food supply. And so they realize what a terrible thing this is, and so they're going to go get Samson. Verse 6, the Philistine says, "Who has done this?" And they answer, "Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he's taken his wife and given her to his companion." So the Philistines came up and burned her and her father's house with fire. And so the Philistines take it out on Samson's wife and father-in-law, kill them, burn the house down with fire. And then Samson does what's described in Scripture as a hip and thigh slaughter, verses 7 and 8. And Samson said to them, "Since you would do a thing like this, I will surely take revenge on you, and after that I will cease." So he attacked them hip and thigh with a great slaughter. Then he went down and dwelt in the cleft of the rock of Etam. So he attacked them with a hip and thigh slaughter. So what does that mean, a hip and thigh slaughter? Well, the strongest part of a person's body is just below their torso, their hips and their thighs. And a hip and thigh slaughter then is a slaughter to the extent that it breaks the strength of an enemy. And so this is why he says, after that I will cease. Well, why is he going to cease? Well, when he does a hip and thigh slaughter, his understanding is their strength is going to be broken, and so there won't be anything else to do. And so it doesn't say exactly how he slaughtered them, but it was a fight, and it's one in which he was victorious, and it's one in which, he thought at least that he had broke the strength of the Philistines. And so after this, then the Philistines go to the men of Judah. Verse 9, it says, "The Philistines went up and camped in Judah and deployed themselves against Lehi. The men of Judah said, 'Why have you come up against us?' And they answered, 'We have come to arrest Samson to do to him as he's done to us.'" So they want to break his strength. And ultimately they do, as we look at the end of the story. So he had broken their strength, and so they now want to break his strength. And they want to do a hip and thigh slaughter on him. And so the men of Judah, his own people, the people of Israel, from the men of Judah here, they go and they turn him in. His own people turn him in. And so verse 11 says, "Do you not know that the Philistines rule over us? What is this you have done to us?" So they have just, there's not a lot in these chapters about the state of Israel at the time and their attitudes, but this tells something of their attitude. And that is that they had just accepted this. They had just accepted the rule of the Philistines over them. And we've come down to arrest you, verse 12. And Samson said, "Swear to me that you will not kill me yourselves." And so they delivered him, and they tie him up, and they bring him to the Philistines. And so in verse 14, the Philistines go to attack him. The Lord comes mightily against him, and he kills 1,000 of them with the jawbone of a donkey. And he sang a little song, or we might say in our vernacular today, he sang a little ditty while he was doing it. Verse 15 says he found a fresh jawbone of a donkey. He reached out his hand and took it and killed 1,000 men with it. And Samson said, with the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of a donkey, I have slain 1,000 men. And you, maybe you've seen some movies where you would see people working on a railroad, or maybe working in a mine where they're breaking up rocks or hammering a drill into rock or something like this. And in order to keep the rhythm of swinging the hammers, then they would usually have an older man that, had been working for a long time, and he really didn't have the strength to swing the hammer anymore, but he would kind of oversee the workmen, and in order for the workmen to keep their rhythm, he'd kind of sing a little ditty or sing a little song that would keep the rhythm of the hammers going, and probably just keep their mind off of the monotony of what they were doing. So that's what I think of when I see what Samson says here. This probably isn't politically correct, but heard the little ditty, 1 little, 2 little, 3 little Indians, 4 little, 5 little, 6 little, whatever. And that's when I see what Samson's saying here, heaps upon heaps with the jawbone of a donkey, I've slain 1,000 men. Heaps upon heaps with the jawbone of a donkey, I've slain 1,000 men. What if you were the Philistines and you were trying to defeat Samson, and he's just standing here, repeating this little song to himself while he's whooping up on these 1,000 Philistines? Well, and so it was, when he had finished speaking, that he threw the jawbone from his hand and called the place Ramoth Lehi. And so he's just been turned over to the Philistines by his own people. He has been attacked by the Philistines, and he's just defeated the Philistines. But evidently, the killing 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey while you're singing a little song takes a lot of work. And so he feels like he's about to die of thirst. Verse 18, then he became very thirsty, so he cried out to the Lord and said, you have given this great deliverance by the hand of your servant. Now shall I die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised. There's a lot that Samson knows. He knows that God is the source of his strength. And he knows that all the blessings that he enjoys are from God. But yet, in his life, he's not inclined to follow God and to do what's right. And so now, when he's experiencing the hardship and the discomfort, and he's suffering here with thirst, he feels like, well, now I'm just going to die of thirst. And so he prays to the Lord. There's only 1 or 2 prayers we have recorded that Samson ever uttered. Now, perhaps he uttered more. Perhaps he prayed more. Perhaps when he was younger, he was more faithful. We just don't know. But you have this prayer, and then you have the prayer when he is fastened to the pillars in the temple of Dagon. And really, it's just the prayer of his death. And so he is given water by God. Verse 19, God split the hollow place that is in Lehi, and water came out. He drank, his spirit returned, and he revived. Therefore he called its name En-hakkore, which is Lehi to this day, and he judged Israel 20 years in the days of the Philistines. This could have been an event, and should have been an event, that turned Samson around, that made him realize that, I need to start doing better. I need to start living better. But the very next chapter indicates that he really didn't do any better, that he goes right back to his old ways here, it seems like, at least very, very quickly. So all of these things should have served as a warning to Samson. There are lots of warning signs here. God's people are not faithful enough that they will stand firm with Samson against the Philistines. They're willing to turn him over. God gives him a great deliverance. And the fact that he comes up with this little saying while he's delivering him indicates that it was easy. It seems like, well, this is no problem. You know, slaying 1,000 Philistines, just no problem at all. And then he feels like he's going to die of thirst, and God provides for him, provides water for him. His spirit revives. All these things are warning signs that should have made him pause, stop, reflect, and repent, and then return to faithful living before God. And if he did, we don't have any record of it, and it didn't last very long, it doesn't seem. Because in chapter 16, he encounters the delightful Delilah, and things just go downhill from there. So in this chapter, we'll kind of head the first part of this chapter with this heading: Samson deliberately toys with sin. He knows that the Philistines are the enemies of God's people. And he doesn't go down to Gaza to inflict punishment upon the Philistines. He goes down there, perhaps curiosity, perhaps looking for a woman. Of course, he found one. But he goes down there for the wrong reason. He goes down there for a lot of reasons. A lot of people go to Las Vegas today, to sin and think that they can do so out of the sight of God, out of the sight of God's people. And so I don't know that that was the case, but it seems to me that this might have been his thinking. So look at verse 1. It says, Samson went down to Gaza and saw a harlot there and went into her. And so he goes down. This is not Delilah. This is another woman. And so he is attacked by the Philistines. And then he gets up the next day, and he basically takes the gate of the city and takes it up to the top of a mountain, or a hill that faces Hebron, verse 3. And then he goes, verse 4, he goes to loved a woman in the valley of Sorek whose name was Delilah. This was another woman besides the harlot in verse 1, as I understand it anyway. So she's in the valley of Sorek, and the lords of the Philistines see an opportunity here. Evidently, they know Delilah pretty well. They know how to get her to be their spy, so to speak, to do their work for them. And so he really has a problem with women. We see this early on in the career of Samson. The first thing is he wants to go marry a woman who is not an Israelite, and that gets him into trouble. He then goes to this harlot in Gaza, which in itself is a sin, and that gets him into trouble. Now, when I say him being attacked by the Philistines, or Philistines surrounding him, and so they can spring a sneak attack on him, the reason Samson is, let me back up, the purpose of Samson's life is so that he can defeat the Philistines. And so, you know, when he does these things that slays Philistines, that defeats Philistines, like taking the gate of a city. When you take the gate of a city away, you've just taken away its protection, and you have exposed that city to danger. And so Samson has exposed this city where he had been with a harlot. He exposed that city to grave danger. There's nothing wrong with that from the point of doing the work that God has set for him to do. But he is going about it in totally the wrong way. He goes down and to the valley of Sorek, rather, and here again he has trouble with women. And you know, some of the words that I think are very appropriate here, written by Solomon in the book of Proverbs, chapter 7. And really, really you should back up and start reading at verse 26. Verse 6, rather. But we're just going to pick up at verse 21. If you have your Bible, you know, you might want to go ahead and read verses 6 to 27. But for our purposes, I'm just going to read verses 21 to 27. With her enticing speech, she caused him to yield. With her flattering lips, she seduced him. Immediately, he went after her as an ox goes to the slaughter. You think about if you have livestock, if you've got some chickens, or you have a hog, or some pigs, or maybe some steers, and what they get used to every day is you come out to the barn or to the pen where they're kept, and you come out with your bucket, and as you walk up to the pen, you're kind of shaking the bucket. Pretty soon they associate that with the food is here. And so you can walk back and forth across that fence, and they'll just follow you wherever you go because they want the food. Well, Delilah's that bucket of food, and wherever she goes, Solomon's just going to follow her along like a steer would follow the farmer shaking a bucket of feed. And Solomon shows a very apt description here. And this is frustrating too, because Solomon has the same problem with women that Samson has, but that's for another lesson. Anyway, verse 22, the latter part of verse 22, or as a fool to the correction of the stocks, till an arrow struck his liver, as a bird hastened to the snare, he did not know it would take his life. Now therefore listen to me, my children, pay attention to the words of my mouth. Do not let your heart turn aside to her ways. Do not stray into her paths, for she has cast down many wounded, and all who were slain by her were strong men. All who were slain by her were strong men. Well, if you take this and you couple it with the story of Samson here, you might be inclined to think, at least I'm inclined to think, that perhaps Samson was not Delilah's first victim. But anyway, verse 27, pardon me. Verse 27, her house is the way to hell, descending to the chambers of death. And so Samson has a real problem with women and controlling this lust of the flesh, the desire for women. So the Philistines have come to Samson and they said, the Philistines have come to Delilah and they said, they offered to pay her. Verse 5. The lords of the Philistines came up to her and said to her, entice him, find out where his great strength lies, and by what means we may overpower him, that we may bind him to afflict him, and every one of us will give you 1,100 pieces of silver. So you have the lords of the Philistines, and each one of them is going to give Delilah 1,100 pieces of silver. And so no doubt she says she's an instant retirement account here. And so she's very willing, more than willing to do this. And so 3 times she tries to get this secret, the secret from Samson of his strength. And so verse 6, where's the source of your great strength? And so Samson said, well, if they tie me with 7 fresh bowstrings. And lo and behold, guess what happens while he's asleep? The Philistines come in and bind him with this just has to be a great coincidence, in Samson's mind. 7 fresh bowstrings. And so, boy, that upsets her. She doesn't like this. So she asks him again, now, you better tell me the truth, the source of your strength. So he says, well, if they bind me with new ropes, not old ropes, but new ropes, then I won't be exceptionally strong. I'll just be like any other man. Lo and behold, guess what happens? He goes to sleep, he wakes up, and guess what he's bound with? New ropes. And here again, the third time, where's the source of your strength? Well, he says in verse 13, if you weave the 7 locks of my head into the web of a loom. Now, what does he think? Does he not know what's going on here? Well, sure he knows. He may not be very smart, but he's not an idiot, a complete idiot. He knows what's going on, and what he thinks is that he can just toy with sin. That he can just take sin and he can play with it like a cat would play with a little mouse or something. That sin is his toy and he can play with it, and that's what he's doing. Well, it's a dangerous game he's playing. Lo and behold, what happens? He goes to sleep, he wakes up, and guess where all of his hair is? It's woven into a loom. And so, verse 15 says, how can you say I love you when your heart is not with me? How many times have we seen something like this in movies? You know, a man or a woman might say to the other, you know, when they're trying to work out their devious plan and things aren't going the way they want to, they say, well, you don't love me anymore. So she's trying this trick with Samson, and Samson falls for it. And not the first time, not the second or third time, but the Bible says here that she pressed him daily, or verse 16, she pestered him daily with her words and pressed him so that his soul was vexed to death. His soul was vexed to death. This woman is a harlot, okay? And if she's behaving in this way, there's a pretty good solution. It's not his wife. Just leave. If she is pressing you day by day and vexing your soul to where you're thinking, I wish I could just die, get up, open the door, and leave. But he wouldn't do that. See, here's what happened. He took and he toyed with sin, and he thought the little mouse was dead. And he found out that little mouse that he'd been toying with was a big fat rat and latched onto his finger and wouldn't let go and couldn't get rid of it. And so I just look at this, I read this, and I'm amazed. And I think 3 times you think, get a clue, Samson. Don't you know what's happening here? Well, yes, he knows what's happening. But what this shows us is the power of temptation and sin, that even when we know better, even when it's hurting us, and every time we do it, we're thinking, oh, I shouldn't be doing this. You think about alcoholics and drug addicts, and they're going to the bottle, hit the bottle, or to do drugs, and they're thinking, okay, this is the last time. This is the last time. Look at people who are addicted to crystal meth, and they get to where they just look terrible. It destroys their appearance. Their teeth fall out, and every time they look in the mirror, they no doubt think, okay, no more of this. I've got to quit, but just one more time, and then they're going to quit. And maybe that's what Samson thought. That, well, one more time, and then I'll quit. Well, there was one more time, and then he wasn't able to quit. I'm going to back, before we move on from this, I had some other scriptures I want to look at here to show the powerful nature of sin. I'm having a little technical difficulties here. Okay. All right. I think we got that taken care of now. Romans chapter 1 and verse 22, the Bible says, professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. So this, we're going to look at a few verses here in Romans chapter 1. And one of the things we learn about in Romans chapter 1 is the consequences of sin, that when sin progresses, what it brings about. And early on here, Paul says they think they're smart, they think they're wise, but they become fools. You know, when Delilah said, tell me the source of your strength, and he said, well, 7 bowstrings, or new ropes, or weave my hair in a weaving, in a loom. No doubt he thought, well, I'm pretty smart. I'm a wise guy. You know, I sure am getting the hand up on these Philistines, and I'm just toying Delilah along and getting what I want from her, and she's not getting what she wants from me. So aren't I a smart fella? So Paul says they profess themselves to be wise, but they're fools. So all this time, what is Samson? Well, when he marched himself down to the valley of Sorek, he showed how foolish he was there. God gave them over to a reprobate mind. A reprobate mind is a mind that is irrational. It is a mind that is void of judgment. You look at some of the things that people do sometimes and you think, why would they do that? It's irrational, but they do it anyway, and that's the power of sin. Romans chapter 1 verse 31, he says, without understanding. So they've become a fool, they're without understanding, and it just, corrupts and darkens their mind. And so the third point here in our study of these 2 chapters is that Samson has disregarded the warnings, and instead of turning away from sin, he goes and he just deliberately toys with sin, and now he's going to reap the consequences. Delilah has been pressing him time and time again, and ultimately he tells her the truth, and somehow he must think, well, maybe he thought one of 2 things. Maybe he thought, well, she's not going to do it this time. She's not going to tell the Philistines this time. Why he would think that, I don't know. Or maybe he thought, well, God really won't take my strength away, even if my hair is cut, and I forsake the Nazirite vow. And see, this is why. This basically is why. The Spirit of the Lord departs from him. It's the last straw. That Samson has. he was born, as we studied last week. He was born as a Nazirite, like John the Baptist. And so this means he was specially consecrated to God. And he has done many things now to violate that Nazirite vow. And this is the last thing. This is the last straw. And so it's a situation where God's disposition must be, okay, if you're going to depart from me, then I'm going to depart from you. Because that's exactly what Samson has done. He has totally turned away from God, turned away from his vow as a Nazirite. And so at this point, like we read in the book of Romans, God gave them up, or gave them over to a reprobate mind. There's a point in time where the sinner persists so long that the attitude of God is, okay, I've done all I can do. And so now Samson is reaping the consequences. And what we see here in these verses is an illustration of what sin does to the sinner. Let's look at these verses, beginning in verse 18. When Delilah saw that he had told her all his heart, she sent and called for the lords of the Philistines, saying, "Come up once more, for he has told me all his heart." So the lords of the Philistines came up to her, brought the money in their hand. Then she lulled him to sleep on her knees, and called for a man, and had him shave off the 7 locks of his head. Then she began to torment him, and his strength left him. And she said, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." So he awoke from his sleep, and said, "I will go out as before at other times and shake myself free." But he did not know that the Lord had departed from him. Then the Philistines took him and put out his eyes and brought him down to Gaza. They bound him with bronze fetters, and he became a grinder in the prison. Ultimately, the very next verse says, the hair of his head began to grow again after it had been shaven. And what this is foreshadowing is that ultimately in the end, Samson is going to turn back to God. God is going to visit him with great strength one more time, and he's going to have one more great victory in which he's going to slaughter more in his death than he had killed in his life. That's verse 30. So the dead that he killed in his death were more than he had killed in his life. But in the meantime, until that happens, what a great price he has to pay, enduring the consequences of sin. He's made blind. They took him, they put out his eyes. In Romans chapter 1 and verse 21, because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Here again, this is what sin does to the sinner. It darkens the mind. It gets us to a point to where we become spiritually blind. Jesus said in Matthew 6 and verse 23, "If your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If therefore the light that is in you is darkness, how great is that darkness?" In John 3 and verse 19, this is a condemnation, that light has come into the world, and men loved darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil. They'd rather not see than see. Also, he's bound as a slave, and he's put in servitude. They brought him down to Gaza, bound him with bronze fetters, and he became a grinder in the prison. So he was pushing the mill wheel to grind. In John chapter 8 and verse 34, Jesus says, "Most assuredly I say to you, whoever commits sin is a slave of sin." In Proverbs 5 and verse 22, his own iniquities entrap the wicked man, and he's caught in the cords of his sin. In 1 Kings 21 and verse 25, "But there was no one like Ahab, who had sold himself to do wickedness in the sight of the Lord, because Jezebel his wife stirred him up." Similar situation here, where Jezebel, who was a daughter of a pagan priest, stirred up Ahab, and Ahab just willingly sold himself to commit sin. And finally, verses 23 to 25, he becomes an object for ridicule and of blaspheming God. The people would look at Samson grinding in their prison. No doubt he was kind of like a sideshow. People would come down and see him and say, "Look what our God has done to the champion of Israel's God." And they would blaspheme God. And so this ultimately culminates in them having a great feast to their god Dagon. And they said, "Well, we want Samson to come out and we'll make sport with him. We'll torment him, sport with him. And that'll bring glory to the pagan god Dagon." So here is God's champion. Here is a man who had been born with all of the blessings that one could imagine, who was specially consecrated to God, who had great feats of strength, and had the ability, really single-handed, he could have defeated all of the Philistines and delivered Israel from that scourge. But instead, he ended up, instead of championing God's cause and causing people to look to God and glorifying God, they ended up ridiculing and blaspheming God. In Romans 2:21-24, you therefore who teach another, do not teach yourself. You who preach that a man should not steal, do you steal? You who say do not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who make your boast in the law, do you dishonor God through breaking the law? For the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you, as it is written. So God's name among the Gentiles is being blaspheming because of hypocritical behavior of the Jews. And so this is what sin does. It brings about in a person's life, particularly for someone who claims to be a Christian, claims to be the child of God, when they live inconsistent lives. And here you have Samson, who lived inconsistent with his calling. His calling was to be a Nazirite, to be specially consecrated to God. And he was inconsistent with that and lived diametrically opposed to it. And so now he becomes an object of ridicule and for blaspheming God. So what are the lessons here as we wrap this up? If we disregard the warning signs and the roadblocks that God provides for us, then here's going to be the results. And then, I'm getting ahead of myself. If we disregard the warning signs and roadblocks, and then we deliberately toy with sin, and or even as Samson did, just pursue sin with reckless abandon, then we're going to end up exactly where Samson ended up. We're going to be spiritually blinded. We're going to be bound to sin. We're going to be a slave of sin, and we'll be an object of ridicule and an occasion for others to blaspheme God. Now, the story, I don't know that we'd say the story has an ultimate happy ending, because really it's not happy. But ultimately, God is victorious in this. And I wouldn't even say that Samson is victorious, but God is victorious in his purpose. On this occasion, when they're making this great feast, Samson pulls down the two main pillars that hold up the temple of Dagon. It comes in and collapses on all of the thousands that are there. And so it says in verse 30, the dead that he killed in his death were more than he had killed in his life. And it really is unfortunate that it was not the other way around. Well, thank you for joining us. Next time we're going to begin studying the book of Ruth. The events of the book of Ruth take place during the period of the Judges. And so really we will study this under the banner of the time of the Judges. Well, we're going to stop there. Thank you for joining us. God bless you. Have a great day.